Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to More Conversations. President Trump recently slapped duties on $200 billion of Chinese imports and threatened to kick in $257 billion more, escalating the administration's trade war with Beijing. China was quick to retaliate, imposing new trade tariffs on $60 billion of American goods. The U.S. imported more than $500 billion in Chinese goods last year, but sold only $130 billion into China, establishing a trade deficit that is set to increase this year. China's best-known chief executive, Jack Ma, founder of the e-commerce powerhouse Alibaba Group, said he thinks the trade war could last for 20 years. Who will win this economic Cold War? What will it accomplish for the two countries? How will it affect President Xi's new vision for China? Here to sort things out for us is Elizabeth Economy. Liz Economy is one of the foremost authorities on China in the nation and a senior fellow and director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's the author of a number of books on China, the latest of which is entitled The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. We're pleased to welcome Liz Economy back to the program.
Great to be here, Jim.
Well, Liz, how do you characterize our current relationship with China?
Well, I guess the first word that comes to mind is it's a mess, but let me try to parse that out a little bit. I think the challenge right now, and I think perhaps it's the greatest challenge that I've seen in the relationship in the 20-odd years that I've been studying and looking at it, is that it's we have problems on every front. There are issues obviously in trade and investment, but also the political relationship is fraught. The security relations are also at this point quite strained. And we're missing the two pillars of the relationship that have really helped to keep the relationship solid when it takes a turn for the worse, namely the business community in the United States and civil society. Both of those have been undercut significantly over the past 5 years, or 6 years really now, during Xi Jinping's tenure.
What do you mean by civil society? You mean NGOs in China?
Right. The people-to-people exchange between the United States and China is really one of the foundational elements of the relationship, dating back to the, Nixon-Kissinger opening and ping-pong diplomacy. But we've seen, President Xi passed a new law in China that limits the access of foreign NGOs, foreign non-governmental organizations, into China. So where there were somewhere upwards of 7,000 before January of 2017, there's now between 300 and 400. And these NGOs, U.S. NGOs and others, were working in China on issues like the environment and public health and poverty alleviation, rule of law programs. So without that kind of interchange, with this slowdown in people-to-people relations, again, we're really missing one of those foundational pillars.
Yes. Now, where do we stand at the moment? China broke off trade talks with Trump after he introduced new tariffs and threatened to introduce still more. Things seem to be at a dismal pass.
Right. I was in Beijing in July, and even at that point in time, a lot of Chinese were saying that they didn't think that trade talks before the midterm elections would be that useful. They believed that the president really wouldn't be in the mood to strike any kind of deal, that he would want to appear to be playing tough on China. And so I think there was already in the minds of the Chinese a sense that the best timing would be after the midterm elections in the United States. Also, there's a lot of hesitancy in China about resuming trade talks without adequate preparation. When Liu He, their top trade negotiator and really their top person in charge of the Chinese economy, when he came to the United States last spring, he met with a number of administration officials and found that there were different asks, from China, from different parts of the administration. There's a sense also in Beijing that there's a degree of chaos in the administration, that they don't speak with one voice, and that the goalposts keep changing. If you look back originally to what President Trump said he wanted, $100 billion reduction in the U.S. China bilateral trade deficit. And China said, okay, they came out with about $70 billion worth of goods that they would buy. Then he's like, actually, I mean $200 billion over 2 years. And by the way, you need to address, these really structural elements in the Chinese economy. Made in China 2025, intellectual property rights protection, subsidies to state-owned enterprises. So, at various points in time, what the U.S. administration has asked for has been different. So I think what the Chinese are looking for at this point in terms of pushing forward on trade negotiations is what exactly is the United States looking for? What are they asking? And, what are the Chinese willing to do?
Well, when Liu left Washington in May, he thought he had a deal, and Trump responded by imposing $50 billion in tariffs. Was that a loss of face for Liu, and he was a personal representative of Xi Jinping, so it was a loss of face for Xi as well?
Yeah, I think in general that the people responsible for managing the U.S. China relationship, not just Liu He, but people like the ambassador from China to the United States, Cui Tiankai, and others, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, who are generally accepted as people who understand the United States and are kind of tasked with explaining what's going on here to, President Xi and to the other members of the, top leadership.
Explaining Trump to the Chinese.
Exactly. I think all of them, came in for some pressure, that they are basically under a little bit of a storm cloud because people now say that China has misjudged Trump. So the narrative in China among some scholars and analysts is that basically these U.S. watchers in China got the U.S. wrong.
Don't many of the China players see it this way, that Trump's a businessman, so he makes extravagant going-in claims and then he's willing to negotiate for something much more reasonable?
Well, I think that is what they all thought, right? That was what they anticipated. But again, when the goalposts kept changing, and I think the added sort of sense, when you looked at the security discussions that were going on in Congress and the political discussions, claims of Chinese influence, what was happening in the investment front in Congress, efforts really to try to limit the opportunity for Chinese firms and others to invest in an ever-expanding range of goods in the United States, things that were considered, technologically sensitive or, had people's personal information associated with them. So as the range of goods began to expand, the Chinese began to think there was something more here. And so what the top leadership is saying now, the Xi Jinping and others, is basically the United States is trying to contain China. So it's moved from saying, this is about trade, President Trump is a businessman and we can do business, to the United States fundamentally wants to contain us. And the trade war is in some respects less about trade, because if that's all it were about, we could find a deal, and more about the U.S. saying, China's almost on par with the United States. We don't like the situation, and we want to, prevent China from achieving its great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
So it really is, as former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has said, a Cold War.
Well, I'm hoping it doesn't turn into a Cold War. I mean, I think right now we are in a difficult moment. As I mentioned, I think perhaps the most difficult moment since I've been looking at China, certainly the most difficult moment since Tiananmen. But in 1989. But I think it's possible for the two leaders to bring this back, right? It's possible for us to find some areas of cooperation. Again, back around North Korea, for example, or if we're looking at, infrastructure development globally, that's an area where, of course, China has dominated. The U.S. wants to play more in that field. So I think there are areas that if the two leaders decide we want to, rein this back in, right? We want to find some common ground. They have the power to change the narrative. It's really a question of whether they want to do that.
Well, if we're looking to them to try to give us a helping hand with North Korea, is it a smart strategy or a dumb strategy to start a $500 billion trade war with them?
Well, it's not an ideal strategy. Let's put it that way. But I have to say, I'm not really in favor of that policy of linkage that many presidents adopt, right? Saying we'll be quiet on what China's doing in the South China Sea in order to try to gain some cooperation on climate change. And that's what the Obama administration did. We had President Trump suggest that if China were helpful with regard to North Korea, that we would go easier on China with regard to trade. That didn't happen. And actually, that's another thing that the Chinese talk about, is that they believe that President Trump had made some kind of implicit promise on that front. And they were helpful, right? They, took on more sanctions and did a better job of enforcing those sanctions than we've ever seen before. And yet President Trump turned around and, really started this trade war.
But do you oppose a get tough policy with China? After all, they are a trade violator. Xi Jinping says he's for globalization, but yet they have forced technology transfer, theft of intellectual property. I mean, they're a bad actor in international trade.
Absolutely, and it's one of the things, and I know you've read my book, and it's definitely a strain in there, is that first off, Xi Jinping can stand up at Davos and claim that China is the leader of globalization, but they don't allow for the free flow of capital. They don't allow for the free flow of information. Very little about China is truly, a globalized power, or stands for, I think, sort of the inherent norms of what globalization means.
So it's globalization without openness.
Right. Well, what the Chinese like to say is, globalization with Chinese characteristics. Yeah. So yes, that's in essence what it means. It's one way globalization. China can go out, but nothing can come in. But I think that look, in terms of how to address the sort of trade violations, the issues with the subsidies and market access, all of the problems that we have in the economic relationship, I just don't think that the tariffs are the way to go about doing that. I think the threat of tariffs, even maybe the initial levy of $15 billion, was good for putting the Chinese on notice. But if we really want to make substantial structural change in China, we have to work with the European Union and the Australians and the Japanese and all the other countries, and there are many of them, right, that agree with what we're trying to do in terms of pressuring the Chinese to make changes. On top of that, there are reform-oriented economists and officials in China that also want to make these kinds of changes. I think we really are at a point somewhat akin to the time before China joined the WTO, when you had
World Trade Organization.
Right, World Trade Organization, when Premier Zhu Rongji in China used, right, the WTO, right, China's desire to join the World Trade Organization as a mechanism for forcing domestic reform at home. So I think there's the potential for an alliance with reform-oriented economists within China, but we need to have all of our allies, pushing back on China at the same time. China believes it can withstand pressure from the United States, but not really pressure from everybody linked together.
But what you're really arguing for is a multilateral TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership approach, which Trump said he wanted no part of.
Right. So, of course, in an ideal world, we would find a way to go back into TPP, perhaps backing in through a trade deal with the Japanese or something like that. Barring that, though, I think what you're really talking about is simply having the United States and the other countries, European countries, et cetera, adopt similar standards in terms of reciprocity, for example, right? If the Chinese are closing off markets in China to multinationals, then other countries should do the same to China. That's a different way of pushing back against China, and probably one that is more appealing to the Trump administration. So I think there's an element that you could use reciprocity. The same with intellectual property rights. You could say, you know what, firms that have stolen intellectual property from firms in other countries, don't have the right to sell into this whole range of countries here. So I think there are ways to be creative and push back against Chinese bad practices. I just don't think tariffs get at the structural issues within the Chinese economy that we want to see changed.
Now, China's retaliated with $5 billion in tariffs of their own, which appear to target the Farm Belt and the purchase of foodstuffs that we sell into China, soybeans and corn and cotton. Our ambassador, Terry Branstad, was the governor of Iowa. I mean, how do you think he feels about this trade war?
I would guess that he wishes that we could find some off-ramps pretty quickly. I think he is somebody that wants to have a good relationship with China. I think clearly also he has strong sympathies for the Farm Belt. So I think he'd like for the relationship to find a more even keel. What I think has been surprising to some extent is that you find President Trump's poll numbers in much of the Farm Belt and many of the areas where the Chinese, in fact, have targeted those areas precisely because they believe those are the states where President Trump has the greatest support, that many of those people separate out their support for the president with their desire, to be able to export to China. And so we haven't seen, I don't think, the type of fall in President Trump's polling numbers in many of those states that we would have anticipated, or certainly the Chinese would have anticipated, or that would really bring pressure to bear upon President Trump to maybe shift the way that he's doing business.
But of course, he gave them a $20 billion subsidy, which helps as a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down.
He did, but from everything, and I was out in Minnesota, talking to some people about China, my book, and that's not really what they want to see. Actually, they don't want the subsidies. They want to be able to sell. They want to be able to export. They don't want to lose their customers in China. Subsidies, it's not the way that these farmers want to do business.
So how do you see this trade war is ending? I mean, are China and the United States in any position to uncouple? I mean, they're our third largest trading partner.
Right. I don't see that we're going to completely, decouple, basically, but already we're seeing, companies, American firms. I just had a recent poll that said, 6% of American firms are considering moving their, factories, other investments out of China. Other countries are thinking about moving factories out of China. Now, in some cases, Chinese companies are simply planning to move their own factories and companies over to Vietnam or to Africa in order to avoid the tariffs, right? So it's not clear in the end that these tariffs are going to accomplish, even in terms of the bilateral trade deficit, what the president wants. And as you noted earlier, the trade deficit is slated to grow this year again. So,
yes.
So I think perhaps when President Trump looks and sees that that's what's transpired as a result of these tariffs, maybe he'll consider an alternative way to get at the issues that he wants to get at.
As Polonius said, by indirection, find directions out. But let's get back to your book, which was marvelous, and I read it. It was quite extraordinary. And you talk of Xi Jinping as the third revolution. Maybe you could quickly describe the first and the second.
Sure. I think the easiest way to describe the first and the second is really just to look at a speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2017 when he was reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party for his second 5-year term. In the speech, he said, China has stood up, become rich, grown strong, and is moving towards center stage. The stood up is really the first revolution, and that's, Mao Zedong, the Communist Party, standing up against the Japanese foreign invaders, but really against the Kuomintang, the leading party at the time, political party at the time.
The Chinese nationalists.
Right, and creating,
Chiang Kai-shek.
Exactly, and creating the contemporary Communist Party state in 1949. The second revolution is Deng Xiaoping, right? And
he said Biden hide.
He did. That was his foreign policy, was keep a low profile foreign policy, focus on developing at home, right? Let's raise the standard of living for the Chinese people. But I think, in addition to the Biden hide, what he's really known for is opening up China, right? Opening up China to foreign influences, whether foreign capital or foreign ideas. He believed that China had a lot to learn, a lot to gain from the international community. He introduced the market back into China, and civil society blossomed under Deng Xiaoping. So his was really this period of reform and opening up, and that he termed himself this period the second revolution. And I argue that, yes, Xi Jinping has ushered in a third revolution.
But before we get to the third revolution, Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, believed in peaceful rising. It wasn't a particularly aggressive foreign policy.
That's right. And Deng Xiaoping's, the second revolution really extends beyond Deng Xiaoping's tenure. It really extends all the way until 2012 and the selection of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is the game changer. So whether you're looking at, Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, the two major leaders after Deng Xiaoping and before Xi Jinping, they all basically, followed the sort of dictates, the edicts of Deng Xiaoping.
So what is Xi's vision for China?
Yeah, Xi's vision is, of course, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is all about reclaiming centrality for China on the global stage.
Well, first he claimed centrality for himself.
He did. And so what's important to understand really is how he believes China best gets there. And in that process, he really has created an entirely new model of Chinese politics, right? And that's the third revolution. He has moved from, Deng Xiaoping's collective decision-making process, right?
Consensus.
Consensus and, and sharing power so that different members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, those top 7 to 9 men who govern China, that they all hold different responsibility positions. And Xi Jinping has said, you know what, I think I'll claim all of the really important top spots for myself. Right? I'll sit on top of the Foreign Policy Committee or the Economic Reform Committee or the Cyber Committee. You know, he's amassed an enormous amount of institutional power in his own hands.
It's almost the Mikado. I am the Lord High Executioner.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, you know, I'm sure that there are some in China who would actually describe him exactly like that. I'm sure he would not appreciate that. But with his anti-corruption campaign, no doubt people might see him that way. And of course, he eliminated, you know,
I was thinking more of Pooh Bah than the Mikado. Pooh Bah was everything.
But I think he eliminated the 2-term presidency that, you know, in the Chinese constitution that Deng Xiaoping had instituted in 1992.
No term limits anymore.
No term limits for him as president of the country. So that's the first thing that he's done that's quite significant. The second is just the extent to which he has reasserted the role of the Communist Party into Chinese life, both into Chinese sort of social life, but also into the Chinese economy, right? So the surveillance system, you know, almost 200 million facial recognition cameras in China now. They have the possibility of identifying somebody from 9 miles away, apparently. I mean, it's extraordinary, right? You look at Xinjiang, the far western autonomous region, it's basically turned into a police state. It's so repressive, you know, as many as 1 million Uyghur adults, Muslim Uyghur adults arrested and put into re-education camps. Just an extraordinary amount of penetration by the Communist Party into people's lives.
And crackdown on dissidents.
Certainly a crackdown on dissidents, but even for the everyday person. You know, China's, what they're planning to roll out, the social credit system in 2020, you know, a system of determining people's trustworthiness. Everybody's going to have a social credit score. You know, did you participate in a protest? Did you play too many hours of video games? Did you jaywalk? Did you fail to, you know, repay a debt? All of these will determine things like whether or not you can fly on a plane or ride on a train or get your child into the best school. It's actually extraordinary. So this kind of penetration into people's lives is something we have not seen since the Mao era. And at the same time, the party's taken a greater role in the Chinese economy, right? So party committees in private enterprises and in joint ventures trying to tell the companies where they should invest. You know, party committees generally basically sit around. They're made up of the members of the party in any particular firm. They basically sit around and, you know, read a speech by Xi Jinping and talk about it and don't do much else. But Xi Jinping is empowering these party committees to become actively involved in the economic decision-making of private enterprises and joint ventures, making entrepreneurs in China and, of course, multinationals very unhappy, right? Because that's well outside the corporate governance structure they've set up. And she's really tried to limit, I think, pretty significantly the extent to which foreign ideas can come into the country, both in terms of the NGO law that I mentioned. There's just a new set of regulations on foreign content on television in China that say you can't have any foreign TV content during prime time, right? If you're streaming, you can only have 20% of what you're streaming be foreign content. Every book now in a K through 12 that has any foreign content has to be vetted, which is going to put a huge crimp in all of those international schools that have become so popular in China today. So the degree of control that Xi Jinping is trying to exert in terms of the you know, intellectual ideas that the people have access to, it's really quite extraordinary.
Plus the internet.
Plus the internet, right. And we see a very serious clampdown on the internet.
So where is he going on the world stage? What's his end game? What's his strategy?
Well, his end game, I think, is where you started, which is, you know, a reversal of Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide to a much more ambitious and expansive foreign policy, and that's the fourth part of the model.
What should our strategy be? Should we just try to scotch them in all of these ambitions?
Well, I think when the ambitions threaten, you know, basic principles, you know, freedom of navigation or basic human rights or free trade, absolutely, we have to push back. And we need to work with our allies to do that. This shouldn't be a U.S. China bilateral competition. This is about principles. and values. And so I think what we really need to do is work with others. But we still need to find common ground with China. We shouldn't allow the relationship to spiral down to the point that it's at right now. And it's not impossible to continue working with them in certain areas, even as we have challenges in many others.
So our strategy should be to bring in allies and work with them collectively toward China, in your view, and then also to share common interests with China and work with them
and
directly.
to compete. I mean, part of this too, goes back to what are we doing at home? What are we doing at home to ensure that we are the leaders in, autonomous vehicles, to ensure that our economy is as strong as possible? What are we doing to ensure that, we can compete with China in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia? So it also requires us to bolster our own internal resources.
So Liz, unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
And the question is, has Xi's third revolution begun to fizzle?
I don't think it's begun to fizzle.
It hasn't begun
to
fizzle.
Don't think
Liz
it's
Economy,
still bubbling strong.
Thank you so much for coming by. You're wonderful to do this. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best. Oh, that was wonderful.
Okay, thanks.
Well, you got a lot.
Sorry, I can't.